Salam Sejahtera, a very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, welcome on board Malaysia Airlines Flight MH4 from Kuala Lumpur to London. My name is Alif Yoska, your co-pilot. With me on the flight deck.
I've been flying for almost 30 hours, and the flight attendants won't stop crying. 30 hours ago, I hopped on a late-night flight from New York heading to Los Angeles. After boarding, I saw that I had an entire row to myself. Takeoff passed without incident, and soon I was stretched out for a nap across the row. I slept for a few hours. I don't know how long, but I woke up to some severe turbulence. It's possible that the lights in the cabin went out for a moment, but I was so disoriented that it's hard to say. I checked my phone to see that it was 4:03 a.m., which I figured gave me about an hour until we landed. When I looked out my window, I was shocked to see nothing but wide open ocean. My jaw dropped. There's obviously no ocean between New York and Los Angeles. I hit the button to call the flight attendant and spent the next few minutes racking my brain for a lake that could have possibly been big enough to explain what I was seeing. I jumped when the attendant flipped off the light. She was grinning from ear to ear, and tears were pouring down her cheeks. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked. I froze for a moment at her reaction before deciding to just ask my question. "Where are we? Why does it look like we're flying over an ocean?" She wiped her cheeks to clear the tears, still grinning wildly. "Sir, we'll be landing in about an hour." Okay, thank you," I said. After she left, I checked the clock on my phone again. 4:03 a.m. blinked back at me. It hadn't changed. I had to have been waiting with my call light on for at least 5 minutes. How was it possible that it hadn't changed at all? I opened up my laptop and saw it too displayed 4:03 a.m. I pulled out my phone, started a stopwatch in the app, and spent the next 2 hours looking back and forth between the clocks, waiting for them to change. They never did. I tapped the shoulder of an older woman sitting in the row ahead of me. She looked back, an annoyed expression across her face. "Yes?" she asked. "Do you know how long until we land?" I asked. She narrowed her eyes. "That flight attendant said it would be about another hour." I shook my head in confusion. "That flight attendant? We talked almost 2 hours ago. We should have landed already." She stared at me as if I was crazy. I was going to continue trying to convince her, but I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun to see a male flight attendant grinning down at me, tears pinging off his cheeks onto my shoulder. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to calm down, or I'll be calling the captain." I told him that wouldn't be necessary and sat back. He removed his hand and stepped away. The flight attendants continued to stop by every few hours offering meals. My stopwatch continued to tick up and is now telling me that I've been on this plane for more than 30 hours. I've explored all of coach and tried talking to some of the other passengers, but they've all told me that they're expecting to land in an hour or so. Around 3 hours ago, I tried getting into first class. I made it past the curtain but was escorted back by 2 grinning flight attendants. Their grip on my arms were like iron. "Sir, the seatbelt sign is on," one said. "Please remain in your seat with your buckle fastened. We'll be landing in about an hour." I'd just about given up hope when a woman came down the aisle dressed in a business suit. She didn't look at me or slow down, but she dropped a piece of paper onto my tray as she made her way to the bathrooms at the back of the plane. I shot a look around before unrolling it. It said, "Are you stuck too?" I pulled out a pen and wrote yes. It's been 30 hours. I folded the scrap of paper up and set it on the tray closest to the aisle. She left the bathroom and picked it up as she passed. It's been 20 minutes since then. I don't know why, but I don't think the flight attendants would like it if they knew we were talking. It doesn't matter. I have to do something. A few hours after the businesswoman picked up her piece of paper with my message, she came back down the aisle and sat in the seat beside me. She bent over, trying to stay low. "So, you're stuck too?" she asked. I kept my voice low. "Yeah. My name's Jack, by the way. I'd say nice to meet you, but... She nodded. I'm Mary. You're wrong. Getting your message was by far the best thing about the past day. I've spent the last day and a half thinking I was alone in this. She paused for a moment, looking up the aisle. When she spoke again, her voice was a whisper. So, Jack, you have any theories on what the hell's going on? I considered lying but decided the truth was for the best. I think we might be dead. Mary shook her head. Maybe if it were just me or just you. If this was some cosmic train to hell, why would there be two of us who realize what's going on? No idea. Mary pulled out her phone and handed it to me. It displayed the Wikipedia article for Flight MH370, the airline that disappeared in 2014. I read through the article carefully. There were dozens of theories trying to explain what happened. They ranged from hypoxia to suicide to aliens. Doesn't tell us much, I said. Not much other than that this may have happened before, she said. How about you? Any theories as to why anyone else can't see what's going on? We talked it over and realized one thing we had in common was that we were both fast asleep at 4:03 a.m. There's no way we were the only ones asleep at that time though. Maybe everyone else was just napping. I don't know about you, but I was well and truly asleep. The cabin lights flicked off and a dozen red emergency lights in the floor flicked on, casting the cabin in a red glow. The intercom crackled to life saying, "Passengers, please return to your seats. The seatbelt sign is fastened and we may experience some turbulence. We'll be landing in about an hour." Mary froze. Should I go back? She asked. Maybe they won't notice if you're gone. But maybe they already know and they're just trying to separate us. Mary nodded. We should stay together. That's a better idea. The intercom crackled again. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to announce the arrival of the captain. We'll all be given the opportunity to speak with him. Please remain in your seats until he calls you. If you need assistance, don't worry. A flight attendant will happily help you on your way. Sounds of passengers getting to their feet echoed from further up in the plane. We sat in silence, trying to get a look through the curtain separating us from first class. The captain? I asked. No idea. But it didn't sound like they were talking about a pilot to me. Did they? Nope. That's when a pungent sulfur smell hit us, so strong that I had to resist the urge to gag. It reminded me of the worst rotting eggs I ever smelt in my life. But the old woman sitting ahead of us didn't react. She just kept watching a movie on the back of her seat. Don't cough, I said to Mary. We fought it for a few long seconds before giving in, coughing hard and violently. A second later the curtain opened. Mary and I froze, staring down the now red fuselage. Four flight attendants passed through the curtain and made their way down the rows towards us, grins stretched wide across their faces. They were still crying, but this time the tears streaking their faces were darker. It's hard to say with the lighting, but it looked like blood. My eyes weren't drawn to them though. I looked over their shoulders at the figure standing near the front of the plane. It was a black silhouette standing beside the cockpit door. It was at least 8 feet tall and pointing towards us with a single finger. It had called us. The bathrooms. I shouted. We ran towards the back of the plane, the flight attendants closing in behind us. Blood dripped from their grinning cheeks onto the carpet of the plane. The captain is here, he said in a perfect customer service voice. His grin widened as he moved towards us. We made it to the bathrooms, jumping into opposite sides. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my feet against the folding center part of the door to keep it closed. They began banging on the door and pulling at the handle while I fought to keep it closed. I'm sorry, but you'll both need to speak with the captain," one of the flight attendants said. "Jack." Mary screamed. "Jack, help." A distinct snapping sound like breaking metal came from her bathroom. She continued to scream as the sounds of struggle migrated up towards the front of the plane, towards the black figure I had seen. I'd like to say I jumped out and fought them, that I distracted them or did something heroic. I didn't. She was carried away, and a few short seconds later her screaming was cut off. That was a few hours ago, and I'm still locked inside this bathroom. I keep trying not to think of what they've done with her. The thing at the front of the plane didn't seem human. I hope it didn't kill her, not after she was shouting for my help like that. I couldn't take that. I haven't heard any movement outside in a few hours, but I'm terrified to open the door. I'm far from the seat outlets, so my phone's almost dead and I haven't eaten in way too long. If I go out there, will the flight attendants remember? What if that thing is still waiting for people? I don't have much time to make a decision. After another dozen hours or so, I opened the bathroom door. The lights in the cabin were back to normal and I couldn't smell any sulfur. I cautiously made my way back to my seat and almost cried when the grinning, crying flight attendant came by offering a meal. That crappy airline food was the most delicious thing I'd ever eaten. When I'd finished, my mind immediately turned to Mary. What had happened to her? I crept down the aisle towards first class, trying to keep a low profile. Surprisingly, the flight attendants were nowhere to be seen. They'd almost seemed to ignore me, almost as if they wanted me to find her. She had a row to herself and was staring down at her phone in the window seat. I slid into the aisle and shook her arm. "Mary," I hissed. She pulled out her headphones and stared at me with a surprised expression. "Yeah? What's going on? Are you okay?" I asked. "What did that thing do to you? What did they do to you?" "I'm sorry, remind me how I know you?" "What do you mean?" We just I realized with sinking horror that she had no idea who I was. I fought back tears. "Mary, how long have you been on this flight?" She checked the watch on her wrist. "Well, it's 4:03 a.m., so a few hours at least." She stared at me the same way you'd look at a person claiming they were the second coming of Christ. Her tone was low and reassuring. "Hey, don't worry so much. Look on the bright side. We'll be landing in about an hour." I felt an iron grip on my arm and looked up to see two flight attendants. "Sir, this area is for first-class passengers only." They were still crying and grinning, but just with tears this time. I could still see streaks of blood staining the front of their uniforms though. I was escorted back to my seat where I spent the next several days. Attendants continued to stop by with food. I would use the bathroom and soon was going absolutely crazy with the monotony. In retrospect, those few days weren't so bad. There's a lot of content on the internet after all, even with crappy plane Wi-Fi. No, it didn't get really bad until around 10 days later when the Wi-Fi failed. It was sometime a week later that I lost control and began screaming for a flight attendant. They didn't come for several minutes, but eventually one did. Just let me see the captain," I asked. The flight attendant bent low and spoke with that same customer service voice. "I'm sorry, sir, the captain has made his decision regarding you quite clear. You didn't answer his call and will, therefore, wait." "How long?" "Quite a while, I'm afraid." "Don't worry though, sir, we'll be landing in about an hour." She straightened and walked away. I started making notches on various parts of the seat back to keep track of different things. One notch for each time I used the bathroom, one for each meal, one for every time I watched a given movie, that sort of thing. It was hell. I watched every movie in the seat back a dozen times over. If I ever acted up badly enough, I would be escorted back to my seat by one or more flight attendants. Any attempt at conversation with other passengers was met with confusion by them, followed by a quick escort back to my seat. I'd guess it was on or around day 30 that, In a moment of panic and psychosis, I broke my laptop and phone, screaming at the top of my lungs. No one around me reacted in any way. 2 months later, I stunk. The muscles in my legs were tight and cramped constantly. I finally concluded that suicide was my only option after my 120 rewatch of Thor Ragnarok. I got to my feet and limped towards the emergency exit. I knew normally the pressure inside the airplane forced the doors closed, but I figured that nothing about my situation was normal. If this didn't work, I'd find some other more painful way to go. I grabbed at the handle and swung it up. To my shock, the door opened easily, though no wind of any kind whipped around the cabin. It remained the standard slightly too cold temperature that it had been for the past who knew how long. The open door called to me, a black portal out of the plane. I stared at it for a long moment, almost too long. An attendant's hand grabbed my shoulder, pulling me away. In a fit of anger and strength that surprised me, I wrenched away and jumped out of the plane. The wind whipping past my face was almost magical, a new sensation after so many months of the same. The ocean below me grew closer and larger, and I realized that suddenly, I didn't want to die after all. It grew larger and larger and larger until it seemed that all I could see was darkness and waves. I impacted the surface of the water so fast and hard that my entire body jerked around in the seat. I pulled my hand back, sucking at my bruised knuckle. I'd hit it on the seat in front of me. "No," I whispered, then shouted, "No! No! No!" A flight attendant ran down the aisle, kneeling beside me. "Are you okay, sir?" I clenched my hands into fists, almost swinging at her. But then I realized. She wasn't grinning. She wasn't crying. To be honest, she looked a little scared of me. I reached my right hand down to my pocket where I could feel my now unbroken phone. 4:04 a.m. "Sir, if you can calm down, we'll be landing in about an hour." My mouth tasted like ash. "Thank you," I managed. "I will." I stared unblinking at my phone. It now displayed 4:05 a.m. Then I looked out my window and began to cry at the sight of city lights below me. We did land in about an hour. I can't even begin to explain why or how, but I'm currently sitting in an airport cafe typing this out. I'm free. I'm out. And I'm never going flying again. At one time, I didn't believe ghosts exist. I used to mock the statement while others embrace it. I don't believe in anything unless my eyes lay on whatever I'm looking at. At first, if someone told me anything about a ghost, I would probably make fun of them. All I would do is stand there and mock them, or well, at least that's what I used to do. It all started on a cold winter night. The wind outside was howling and the trees were scraping against my window with a nasty chalkboard scrape sound. I was inside reading a novel while listening for the doorbell to ring. My friend Quincy was coming over and we were going over to the old mansion up on Devil's Peak. Devil's Peak was supposed to be the scariest and creepiest place anybody could possibly be, or at least that is what I'm told. I was heading to my refrigerator when suddenly a loud crash came from outside. I don't know what it was, but going to open the door sent a shiver straight down my spine. I slowly reached for the doorknob when suddenly unbelievable pounding hit the front door and I fell backwards, landing on my back. The door came flying wide open and to my surprise it was Quincy. It seems he tripped and knocked over my plant, causing it to hit the ground and make the crashing sound. Quincy came barging in, telling me on his way here he heard noises coming from the old mansion on Devil's Peak. Before I replied to him, I lifted myself up and took a breather. I told him that's impossible since no one has lived there for years, but he insisted that it was true. I finally asked him what the sounds were. He told me in very specific detail that he heard a lady's scream, a baby's laughter, and a husband's cry, all in that order. At first I thought about it, then replied to him in a clear statement, "Let's go take a look at that mansion." Having to walk up the hill to Devil's Peak took a lot of energy only because the hill was huge and steep. As we grew nearer to the mansion, I started wondering if Quincy was telling the truth or lying to scare me. Either way, I would get to the bottom of whatever this so-called noise was. We finally reached the top of the hill, and to my surprise, the mansion was bigger than I expected. It was blue with white splattered paint in a few spots and had a wide double door crafted out of marble and wooden windows perfectly spread a good 5 feet away from each other. The curtains looked as if they were dusted only 5 minutes before we arrived. The house looked as if it had never been touched. Walking up to the front door, I realized Quincy was still at the top of the hill staring at the mansion. I grabbed him and told him there was nothing to be scared of, and soon afterwards we heard thunder. We both jumped and screamed, then plop, we were on our butts. As we got up and cleaned ourselves off, it started raining, so I advised we go in the mansion until the weather cleared up, and so we did. Walking into the mansion felt comforting and yet disturbing. I noticed there was some polished furniture in what seemed to be the living room. I told Quincy I was going to check it out, and he told me not wander off because there might be ghosts. I told him not to worry and that there were no such thing as ghosts. As soon as I turned around, thought I smacked my head dead on with a piece of wood hanging from the ceiling. Quincy laughed hysterically to the fact I hit my head. I waited for the pain to go away and ventured into the living room. When I entered the living room, something didn't feel right, nor did it feel bad, but something caught my eye before I thought about these feelings. It was a record player, but it didn't have the usual needle you put on the record. Instead, it had a big tuba-looking thing above it. Quincy came into the room a few minutes later, looking around, and also observed the weird record player. I told him the sound probably came out from the top. My eyes, while scanning the record player, caught a circular shape in the distance hanging off the side of the table. I walked over to it and grabbed it. Picking up the object, I could tell it was a good 50 years old, at least. Plus, to my surprise, it was a record. The names and songs on the records were scratched and faded, so I couldn't tell what kind of music it was, but I was dying to try it out. Quincy urged me to put it down because the record was delicate and could break and cut me at any time. I told him not to worry as I settled the record on the record player and listened, in horror. Quincy and I both gazed at the record player. The record did not play a song, but in its place a recording of someone's dark, deep voice. The voice sounded depressed, and by the deepness of the voice it sounded male. Anyway, the voice spoke, and not to itself, but I think us. Yes, it was us. The voice was telling us that we were now trapped and that the way to get out was to live through 3 events in the past and not only see the events, but feel them. I shut my mouth after the voice stopped talking and thought to myself, this can't be real. I did not just hear a voice from 50 years ago talk to me. While I was troubling with the fact that a voice talked to us, Quincy threw himself at the door, and to our astonishment, it was boarded up. My mouth went wide and I was speechless. We were locked inside by whatever forces kept us here, and then we heard something. I completely lost all thought of anything at the moment, and I'm guessing so did Quincy, because what we heard was phenomenal. It was a lady talking. Then, out of nowhere, shriek. A loud scream came out of all directions and shattered the windows above us by the stairwell. Then I came up with an idea. Whoever is messing with us forgot one important thing: locking the windows, or better yet, making them soundproof. I grabbed Quincy and ran up the stairs, and to my amazement, the windows weren't there anymore. Quincy gazed at the hard, solid wooden wall at where the windows were. I told him not to panic, but nevertheless he went into a panic frenzy, screaming and yelling we're going to die. I grabbed him and smacked him, telling him to chill. I had to think, and he wasn't helping. Then something came to me, something important. Didn't Quincy hear a lady scream before we came to the mansion? I ran to Quincy, who was against the wall in fetal position, and asked him what sounds he heard before we came here, and he replied with the very answer I didn't want to hear. He did hear a lady scream. As I dragged Quincy down the empty hallway, we heard it again, but this time clearer. The sound came from the end of the hallway, and so I ran to the other end, leaving Quincy behind, only to find something so horrible and disturbing you would cry. It was a lady, all right, who screamed, a lady with a knife through her back. I gazed in horror as she turned around and screamed, "Help me," over and over again. If that wasn't enough, she was coming closer. I couldn't move for some reason, and as soon as she was an inch from my torso, Quincy came into the room and yelled, "Hail." Finally, I moved just a second before the lady reached for my shirt and I fell on my butt. I got up, turned around, and told Quincy to run, but he stared at me, pointing at my shirt. His mouth was wide open and his eyes scarred with fear. His fingers were pointing dead at me. I asked what's wrong, and he muttered something. I couldn't hear him, so I asked again, and this time he didn't need to answer because I felt a cold breeze hit my chest. I looked down and saw my shirt ripped and my chest bleeding. I thought there is no way I could have done that from falling, but from something sharp touching me, or something like fingernails. The lady ripped my shirt, but I was sure she wasn't real. She was an illusion. There was no way she was alive, or was she? Thinking of the lady, I remembered we were still in the room, so I turned around, and to my amazement, she was gone. She disappeared into thin air, just like a ghost. No, that's not possible. There are no such things as ghosts. Just then we heard another sound. This time it was a baby's laughter. Quincy stared at me, but I already knew why. It was the second sound he heard. Darting ahead of Quincy, I looked back to watch something I wish never happened. Out of nowhere, the ground collapsed under Quincy, and to my horror, I watched my best friend fall into the pits of darkness down below to his death. I tried to jump in, but I didn't have the guts. My best friend was gone. I fell to my knees and started to shed tears. I knew it was my fault. I shouldn't have let him come with me to this place. He died because of my carelessness. I screamed at the top of my lungs and smashed my fist on the ground. After I was done sobbing, I got up, said a few words for him, and started to walk away when I heard something shout from the hole. It couldn't be. It was impossible, but sure enough, the voice was clear enough for me to figure it out. It was Quincy. I rushed back to the hole and screamed his name. A few minutes later, I heard mine. He was alive, but how? I yelled down the hole, "Are you safe?" A few seconds later he replied, "And oh, I'm hanging onto a piece of wood sticking out from the wall." I cried happy tears, then realized that he won't be able to hang for long. I jumped up and looked around for something to throw to him, and I saw a curtain. "Hey, it works for getting out your window, so why not now?" I grabbed the curtain, tying it together to make a line, and shouted to Quincy to hold on, and what made me laugh a little is that he replied saying, "Do I have a choice?" I finished tying the curtain and lifted it down to him and told him to grab it, and so he did. He was heavier than I expected. I used all my strength to pull him up and carry him out of the hole. We sat there for a few minutes catching our breaths, and he finally turned toward me and said with the most compassion I have ever heard, "Thank you." I replied, telling him no problem and that I was glad he was alive, but not long enough for us to hear another noise. I was glad and worried because what we heard was the final sound. A man was crying. Quincy and I got up with newfound courage and carefully walked toward the sound. We came into a white room filled with paintings of a woman scattered everywhere. They were on the wall, the ground, even the ceiling. We looked around and saw nobody, so we turned around and then everything went blank. 5 seconds before it went dark, I remembered a black figure standing in front of us crying and he whispering what seemed to be "IMSORRY." I started waking up to a bright light. I opened my eyes and started to scream, but I couldn't. I was tied to pole, and to my right so was Quincy. It seems he was awake and fully aware of the surroundings. It was a blue room with a baby carriage, toys, a work desk, and some knitting tools. I don't know if I was dreaming, but what Quincy and I saw seemed very realistic. A lady walked into the room not noticing us and slammed the door. She turned around and watched a man, probably her husband, dart into the room. They started yelling and fighting. The husband pulled out a knife from his pocket and stabbed the lady in her back. He backed up and watched her fall on the bed. He looked toward the baby's carriage. He picked the baby up and watched as the baby laughed and smiled. He flipped open the carpet he had on the ground and dropped the baby into the hole he had hidden and started to cry. Then, poof, everything went blank again. I woke up on the porch of the mansion and saw that Quincy was starting to gain conscious also. I helped him up and we started to question each other about if what we had just seen was real. We came up with the conclusion that it wasn't real, so we briefly looked at the mansion and started walking home, and then Quincy stopped and stared in horror at my shirt. I asked him what was wrong about it, so I looked down and saw that it was still ripped. Top 5 Christmas Ghost Stories. Nothing puts the ho-ho-ho in horror like a Christmas Eve full of ghost stories. These holiday frights have been getting us through the long, dark nights since the days of the pagan festival of Yule and have stayed with us in new and exciting variations throughout the centuries. From A Christmas Carol to Krampus, there has been a long and loving tradition of injecting the paranormal into your pageantry, but there are some that have made an impression on us more than others, making them our go-to tales for everything terrifying. Some may be printed, and others just whispered in front of the fireplace, but all of these stories have stayed spooky throughout the years and will likely continue to top the list of Yuletide ghost stories for many generations to come. So, naughty or nice, be sure you're checking this ghost story list twice, because nothing will warm you up this winter better than a stocking stuffed with the supernatural. Story number 1. The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. While Dickens may be the usual go-to for holiday hair raisers from the Victorian age, Henry James is no slouch when it comes to turning out the kind of terrifying tale you can pair with hot cocoa and a tin of cookies. In fact, The Turn of the Screw, first published in serial format in Collier's Weekly between January and April of 1898, has been adapted dozens of times over the past century, appearing on stage, television, film, and even reimagined on the printed page. Opening on a familiar scene, this frame story tells of a group of friends gathered around a fireplace on Christmas Eve, ready to partake in one of their favorite holiday traditions, telling ghost stories. What comes next is one of the most notorious tales in Gothic fiction, the story of an English governess hired to take care of 2 young children who, after the death of their parents, are sent to live on their uncle's estate in Essex. It seems a simple enough job, but it isn't long before the governess starts to sense that something is off about the estate, including a pair of strangers, a man and a woman who she's seen skulking around in the shadows. She goes to the housekeeper, Mrs. Crows, for answers, only to discover that the couple she saw were actually former employees, long dead. What's worse is that they seem to be very interested in the one thing she is there to protect, the children. Whether you're already familiar with the spine-chilling ending, or maybe slept through that week of English 101, we recommend you knock the dust off of this touchstone classic and give it another read. Preferably on Christmas Eve and in front of a fireplace. Story number 2. The Legend of the Mistletoe Bride. The story of the Mistletoe Bride hasn't made it to the big screen yet, but this popular, true-life ghost story has been a staple in England for generations and a must-have on our list of Christmas ghost stories. While the details have been known to change over the years, evolving to fit both the teller and the audience, it is believed that the original story spawned from the tragic, real-life death of Lord Lovell's bride at the Bramshill House in Hampshire, England. The story goes that Lord Lovell and his bride-to-be were set to wed around Christmas, bringing parties from both families to Lovell's estate in Hampshire. There, while hanging mistletoe throughout the house, the families came up with a wedding party game to help pass the time. The rules were simple. Lord Lovell's young bride was to hide somewhere in the enormous mansion while the groomsmen set out to try and find her. Whoever located her first would be crowned the winner and awarded with a playful kiss under the mistletoe. What started off as all fun and games quickly turned sour, though, once the minutes slipped into hours and no sign of the bride could be found. Unbelievably, months went by, followed by years, without any answers. Lovell, heartbroken, was eventually forced to move on. It wasn't until 50 years later, as Lovell's grandchildren played a game of hide-and-seek themselves, that they stumbled upon a secret closet in an upstairs room. There they found an old, wooden chest, sealed shut, with the bride-to-be trapped inside, or at least what was left of her. Of course, the poor lost girl is still seen at Bramshill House around Christmas, moving through the halls at night and calling out for someone, anyone, to find her. But every year, as the holiday season slips away, so does any trace of the mistletoe bride. This tale may not boast the happy ending many of us are accustomed to around this season of giving, but it will nonetheless keep your friends and family on the edge of their seats until Christmas morning. Story number 3. Smee by Anne Burrage. Known for his work in horror and early young adult fiction, Alfred McClellan Burrage may not be a household name to most. Still, in the first half of the 20th century, he was both prolific and popular, especially after his timeless tale of holiday hijinks titled Smee. Published in 1931 in the critically acclaimed short story collection Someone in the Room, this spooky tale of a Christmas Eve gone south has long been a classic for lovers of the holiday ghost story and is still very much read to this day. The story, which also takes on the format of a frame story, a common occurrence in this genre, tells of a young boy on Christmas Eve who, not wanting to join his friends for an after-dinner game, shares a cautionary tale instead. On a past Christmas Eve, the boy had been playing a game of Smee, or hide-and-seek, with 11 of his best friends, taking turns hiding within an enormous, old house known for its mysterious past and haunted reputation. Though the game starts with 12, the children soon find that at some point during their time among the winding corridors and endless rooms, a third player has joined them. This young girl, tall and dark, is eager to take part in the fun, but no one seems to know from where she came. We have no interest in spoiling the fun for you, but needless to say, the game continues on, with more of the girl's past being slowly revealed until the story reaches the likely and gripping conclusion that is sure to please. As far as ghost stories go, you might not find this 100-year-old premise to be all that fresh, but it was very much a new and terrifying concept for its time and only now seems cliché because of its lasting influence on the genre, most notably in the Goosebumps series by R.L. Stine. If you are looking for a short read to help get you into the Christmas spirit, you won't do much better than Smee. And if it hits the spot, we recommend reading the rest of the collection while you're at it. Story number 4. The Ghost of Anne Boleyn. You may be wondering how one of the many wives of King Henry VIII made her way onto a list of ghost stories, or how her subsequent and unfortunate death at the hands of the Mad King relates back to our festive holiday theme. Well, we'll tell you. Long before her marriage, Anne grew up in Hever Castle, the longtime home of the Boleyn family nestled deep within the Kent countryside. It was an idyllic childhood, full of love and happy memories, especially around the holidays, which was Anne's favorite time of the year. All of that would change, though, the day she married King Henry VIII. It should have been a sign, in retrospect, that becoming the second wife of the king who basically invented second wives was maybe a bad idea, especially considering that His Royal Highness' mental health was, by then, declining as quickly as his cruelty was growing. but Anne was in love, and who didn't want to be a queen? So, Anne married Henry, and they enjoyed a few short years of royal bliss until that demon living in Henry started to rear its ugly head once again. It started with rumors around court, people whispering about witchcraft and treason, adultery and incest, and everything in between. To Anne's surprise, most of the accusations stuck, leading King Henry VIII to formally charge her in 1536 and, as we well know, cut off her head. A tragic end within a dark part of history, but for Anne Boleyn, the story isn't quite over. It seems that Anne's spirit didn't stick around to watch King Henry VIII abuse and berate the next 4 wives, one of whom also lost her head, and instead returned to her ancestral home in the countryside. Today, people all over England know about the castle in Kent, now home to Anne's ghost. In fact, she is still seen on the grounds to this day, reliving the happier moments of her life as she slips through the halls or across the bridge that spans the River Eden, her favorite spot. What really stuffs our stocking when it comes to this ghost story, though, is that Anne Boleyn is only ever seen on one day of the year. Her favorite day, Christmas Eve. So next time you are sitting around the Christmas tree, looking for a ghost story to put your peeps in the holiday spirit, remember Anne's story and how she made history the day she lost her head. Story number 5. The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood. The list wouldn't be complete without mentioning one of the most famous stories from England's most prolific ghost story writer, Algernon Blackwood. While it is only a drop in the bucket of fantastic tales that Blackwood put out in the early 20th century, it is by far the most festive. Published in the December 1908 issue of Pall Mall magazine, The Kit Bag is the story of a young man named Johnson who works for a prominent London lawyer who has spent the early winter defending a despicable man by the name of John Turk, accused of murdering and dismembering a young woman. Johnson has been forced to spend a great deal of time in court with Turk, who he despises, and is relieved when the trial comes to an end and he gets to leave everything behind for a Christmas vacation in the Alps. Finding himself short of a bag, Johnson asks if he can borrow one from his boss, who agrees to send it along later that night. When it arrives, though, things start to take a dark turn, leading Johnson to believe that there is more to his new luggage than meets the eye. It begins with ghostly footsteps on the stairs outside his door and quickly escalates to faces appearing on the bag, whispered voices demanding, "It's my bag. And I want it," and the bag itself moving across the room when no one looks. What really turns the tide, though, is when Johnson opens it up, discovering a bloodstain within and an answer to all of his suspicions. He manages to flee his room, leaving the kit bag behind, but the horror is just beginning for Johnson. A truly terrifying tale, The Kit Bag is a classic in its own right, even if it didn't happen to take place during Christmas. But with ghosts and goodwill abound in this seasonal story, it is a perfect fit for our list of ghost story greats. So, when Christmas rolls around this year, do as the pagans and Victorians did before us and pull up a chair, light a fire, and delight your loved ones with a story that will truly fill them with the Christmas spirit and maybe more. Thanks for watching.
5 real short scary stories. Story number 1. Who's in my bed? A father went to say goodnight to his 7-year-old son, very well knowing that if he didn't, his son would have trouble sleeping. It was a nightly routine between them. He entered the dimly lit room where his son waited under his blanket. With the first glance, the father could tell there was something unusual about his son tonight, but couldn't put his finger on it. He looked the same, but had a grin that drew from ear to ear. "You okay, buddy?" the father asked. The son nodded, still with the grin, before saying, "Daddy, check for monsters under my bed." The father chuckled a bit before getting on his knees to check, only to satisfy his son. There, under the bed, pale and afraid, was his son. his real son. He whispered, "Daddy, there's someone on my bed." Story number 2. The cabin. A hiker decided to go on a hike by himself. Something he was not very used to. The whole day was normal. Trees and bushes engulfed his surroundings. He enjoyed being outdoors in the mountains. Nothing seemed strange to him. That was until he was making his way back to his car. He figured an 8-hour hike was good enough. The sky was already getting dark and he needed to get back fast. What was odd was how much he didn't recognize the trail back. He began to panic. Night had already taken over and all he had was a flashlight and no clue on how to get back. He knew it was already too late and too dangerous to keep going through the perilous forest. He began to worry that he would have no shelter for the night when, almost luckily enough, he stumbled across a broken-down cabin. It was dark and seemed like no one had visited it in years, but he knew it was the only place where he could rest until daylight, especially since his flashlight was running out of battery. He knocked on the door a few times, but no one answered, so he let himself in where, strangely enough, a perfect bed fitted for one person awaited him in the center. He knew that if the owner came back, he could explain himself. He was sure that the owner wouldn't mind, or was even probably dead. So he went ahead and got himself comfortable in bed. As he tried to sleep, he couldn't ignore the collection of paintings around the room, portraits of strange-looking people all peering at him, each wearing a smile that sent chills up his spine. Not too long after, his exhaustion from the hike got the best of him and he was able to ignore the faces. The next morning he got up early and was shocked to see that there were no paintings around the room, but windows. Story number 3. The red wristband. A doctor was working at a hospital where the patients were tagged with colored bands. Green, alive. Red, deceased. One night, the doctor was instructed to get a few supplies from the basement of the hospital, and so he headed to the lift. The lift doors opened and there was a patient inside, minding her own business. Patients were allowed to roam around the hospital to stretch, especially those who have stayed long. The rule was to be back in their rooms before 10. The doctor smiled at the patient before pressing the number for the basement. He found it unusual that the woman didn't have a button already pressed. He wondered if she was heading to the basement too. The lift finally reached the floor where the doors opened. In the distance, a man was limping towards the elevator, and in a panic the doctor slammed the elevator button to close. It finally did, and the lift began to ascend back up, the doctor's heart pounding. "Why did you do that?" "He was trying to use the lift," the woman stated, annoyed. "Did you see his wrist?" the doctor asked. "It was red. He died last night." "I would know because I did his surgery." The woman lifted her wrist. "He saw red." She smiled. "Like this one?" Story number 4. Foot. White with red. A man just moved into an apartment and heads to the receptionist to get his keys. The receptionist gave him the key with a smile, but warns him not to disturb the door with no number on his floor. He wondered why, but didn't bother to ask. He was too busy with his new apartment to care. After he finished unpacking, he began to get curious. He questioned why the receptionist would warn him of such things, and so he stepped out of his apartment to check the door with no number. He tried the doorknob first, but it was locked, so instead he got onto his knees and peeked through the keyhole. The apartment he was looking into was empty. His eyes scanned the whole place before stopping at a woman standing face against a wall in the corner. He noticed her pale skin and long black hair before stepping back, suddenly feeling perverted in a way for invading someone else's privacy. He brushed it off, assuming she was someone that did not want to be disturbed. The next day he got more curious about the woman and eventually went back, straight away getting onto his knees. He peeked through the keyhole and saw all red. Red. He assumed that the pale woman must have caught him peeking the last time and covered the hole with something red. He left the door alone and instead went down to the receptionist to ask her questions. The receptionist sighed and asked, "You looked through the keyhole, didn't you?" He admitted to it, and so she felt obliged to tell him the story. She told him that a couple used to live in that apartment a long time ago, but the husband went crazy and killed his wife. However, this couple wasn't normal. They had pale skin, black hair, and red eyes. Story number 5. A mother's call. A daughter was in her room upstairs, doing her homework, when suddenly she heard her mother call to come down for dinner. She jumped onto her feet and began making her way towards the stairs, but before even took a step, hands grabbed her and pulled her into the laundry room besides the staircase. She panicked before realizing it was her mother, her real mother, eyes watery and bloodshot. "Don't go down there, honey. I heard it too." I hope you like these 5 scary stories. I request you to subscribe our channel and support us. Thank you. This happened so long ago that many details are a little blurry, but the feelings from that day still linger. It wasn't like it happened yesterday, yet the memories hold a strange weight. I'll try my best to fill in the smaller details as I recall how things unfolded. It was the last day of school, and I was in the 4th grade, a year that marked the end of my time in elementary school. There was a bittersweetness in the air. Excitement buzzed around me as classmates laughed and talked about summer plans, but deep down, I felt a pang of sadness. This wasn't just another school day, it was a goodbye to the familiar hallways, the playground where we shared so many moments, and the teachers who shaped us. Where kids had to be picked up by their parents' 5th graders. Were allowed to walk home on their own. My mom would always be the one to pick me up. On the last day of school, my friend Dennis and I had a play date planned to celebrate the last day of school. Dennis wasn't in my class this year, but we had been friends since kindergarten. He was in a different dismissal hallway from me after school was over. We single file lined up and walked to the exit door at the end of the hall, where we waited outside by our teacher, Miss Blue. I waited for Dennis's dad to appear from the crowd of parents shuffle in and out of the parking lot next to the doors. Then I heard my name, Tommy. Tommy. I look over and see a man waving at me as he approached. He introduced himself as Dennis's uncle and said he was picking me up. I went over to Miss Blue and said I'm being picked up. She asked, "Where's he, sweetie?" and I pointed to Dennis's uncle. "Who waited, Miss Blue?" Miss Blue dismissed me, and I went with the man. He led us through the crowd and was a very quick and jittery talker. Like, he spoke fast and had a bit of a stutter. He was walking incredibly fast. It was almost hard to keep up with him with my backpack on. He explained to me that his brother, or Dennis's dad, was working later than expected, so he was driving me back. We got to his car, which was a dark red hatchback type car from what I remember, and it took me this long to acknowledge the giant elephant in the room. Where was Dennis? Why were we picking him up too? The man turned to look at me in the back seat and said that Dennis was already at his house. I was shy around people I didn't know, especially adults, and I wasn't one to openly speak my mind. If I was confused, but I was very confused, this was making less and less sense the whole drive. The man kept yapping, telling stories of his days in elementary, asking me questions like what sports I played, what we're learning in class. If I had to guess, we were in the car for like 10 minutes, which honestly, for our town, where houses were right on top of each other, that was a while. My house was a 5-minute walk away from the school. We were definitely in an area I wasn't familiar with. When he parked the car in front of his house looked pretty normal to me from what I remember. He let us inside and shut the door and locked it. Behind us, it was really, really dark inside the place, and I realized why all the curtains were shut. It almost felt like it was nighttime in there, especially because the only source of light was a dim lamp in the corner of the room. He then looked at me and smiled. I said, "Where's Dennis?" And he started acting really jittery and nervous seeming. He said something like, "Oh, I think he's downstairs playing video games. Give me a second. Wait. Here he then disappeared into a nearby room. And I heard a door open and then footsteps descending into a basement. I know my heart was already racing. I knew I was in danger. I went to the door to quietly try to open it, but I couldn't. It had some kind of lock that must have needed a key. For I really started to panic now, yet I still probably held out a little bit of hope that Dennis would be coming up those stairs. But I knew the chances of that were slim. I regretted entering the house. I did the only thing I could think to do. I went to the kitchen and found a phone hung on the wall. I picked it off the receiver and dialed 911. The first thing I said when they answered was in a whisper, "Please come to this house. I've been kidnapped." They heard me, they acknowledged me, but I didn't say another word. I hid the phone under a towel in the corner of the room with 911 still on the line. I hurried back to where the man left me, as I already heard his footsteps coming back. Upstairs then he called my name saying, "Come down, Dennis is down here." Then there was a pause. He repeated my name, and when I didn't answer, he came up the stairs fully to look at me. He asked me if I was okay. I felt so sick and I was so scared. I hated myself for walking into the situation and not being wiser. I asked in a very scared voice if I could leave, and I remember the change in his face. His fake friendly smile disappeared as he realized that I was no longer falling for this. He walked closer to me in a gentle manner until he was close enough to grab my wrist aggressively, and he started pulling me towards the basement. I screamed and cried, and he screamed at me, "I'll let you go if you stop and behave." So I listened. I went down the stairs, and halfway down the door slammed shut behind me. And I heard it lock. I walked fully down the stairs to this empty, unfinished basement with a concrete floor and one singular support beam in the middle of the room. There was a depressing yellow glow in the room from one exposed light bulb hanging on the ceiling. If there was a place you'd imagine kidnapped children to go, this would be. And I heard his heavy footsteps upstairs. You could hear everything in this house. I don't know what he was doing, but I heard him walking around for a while. Then he came to the basement door, opened it, and he called down asking if I'm hungry. I replied no, I didn't want him. Going into the kitchen, seeing the missing phone, he shut the door and locked it again. I sat down there waiting with my heart in my throat. And then I heard the doorbell ringing 3 times from upstairs, followed by banging sounds, which were definitely the sounds of police banging on the door. I would refrain from screaming until I heard the front door open, but I never heard the man's footsteps approach the door. The doorbell kept ringing, and I kept hearing the bangs. This went on for some time until I heard a really loud bang sound, and then multiple heavy footsteps and multiple screaming voices. I started screaming for help as loud as I could at the top of the stairs, banging on the door. The door was unlocked, and a police officer on the other side grabbed hold of me and hurried me outside. There were at least 3 cop cars outside. I had to tell everything to 2 of the cops outside as we waited for my parents to show up. The man from inside was brought outside and into a cop car in handcuffs, and that was the last time I ever saw him. When my parents arrived on the scene, my mom was bawling her eyes out. There had already been a hole at the school as cops were called, and Dennis's dad realized what happened. This man was a work associate of Dennis's father. When he somehow learned that Dennis's dad would be picking up Dennis and I from school on the last day, he seized the opportunity to do what he did, a complete sick __. I don't know how he found out what I looked like as I got older. I never really asked for more details because I try not to think about it. My mom went to counseling with me for months after this incident. Let's just say my parents didn't have kind words for Miss not verifying if I actually knew the person picking me up, if I didn't think to call the police before he basically threw me in that basement. I know for a fact I'd be dead right now. This was like 17 years ago. That man might be out of prison for all I know. It was junior year of high school, and it was the last day of school. A lot of people cut school this day or left early after lunch period. My friends and I were some of the latter. It was a stormy, dark day. A bunch of people from our grade originally planned to hit the beach on the last day of school, but that was obviously canceled, so my smaller core group of friends decided to do something else. There used to be an abandoned elementary school in town that hadn't been used for like 10 years. There were plans to tear it down by the year's end. so still wanting to do something fun on the last day of school. We all agreed to break into the building and just _ around exploring. There were no cameras in that old building, and on a stormy day no one would be outside monitoring the place or anything. So we all left after lunch period. Our friend Eddie already had a car and his license, so he drove us all to the abandoned school. The school was in the middle of a neighborhood, not on any main roads or anything. There was a back parking lot covered by overgrown bushes and trees on one side, and the walls of the school on two other sides. It was a perfect spot to park and go unnoticed. The place wasn't boarded up or anything, it was just locked up. Eddie had a baseball bat in his trunk that he took out to smash one of the windows of the school. I was honestly so nervous that even through the pouring rain, one of the houses over the fence would hear the smashing sound. We all watched and nervously laughed as Eddie swung the bat into the window in front of the car. And after a few good swings smashing it, he pushed away the stray pieces of glass stuck to the frame with a bat. And then he waved us over. We one by one climbed through the window into the school. My logic was that the school was being torn down anyway. What does a broken window matter? We all were inside the building. Now the window we climbed through was actually one of the windows for a classroom. A lot of stuff was still left in the room, including the desks and some decorations on the walls. Based on the decorations, it looked like we were in a 4th or 5th grade classroom. It was very surreal to be inside of what was once an active classroom, where little kids would come to learn. Now nothing but a cold, dark, and abandoned room collecting dust waiting to be destroyed. The sounds of thunder and lightning outside also added to the surreal feeling of it all. There were no lights on in the building. Power to the place was likely cut completely. We anticipated this, though. The flashlights on our phones were plenty to get around and see. Even without them, it wasn't completely pitch black in there's. Even though it was a dark day, some light was still creeping in through the windows and doors. We started traversing the hallways, going from room to room. Each classroom was still full of desks and chairs that hadn't been sat in probably a decade. We all four were in the same classroom when there was a sound that echoed down the hallway and into the classroom. We all went silent and turned off our lights for a moment. After a flash of lightning, we slowly accepted that it was probably nothing, so we continued on. We just went from room to room as our wet shoes all squeaked on the floor. Sneaking around wasn't possible. Really, a lot of things in the school were visibly decaying. You could really tell no one had stepped foot in there in ages. As we neared the corner of the hall, I turned around just to look back down the other way, and at the doorway of one of the classrooms, it looked like there was something sticking out from the classroom. I asked my friends to also look. Their lights would maybe help see what it was. When all four of us were pointing our phone flashlights toward the door, whatever that thing we were seeing was retracted into the classroom. All four of us quietly went _ amongst ourselves, and we started running down the intersecting hallway. We stopped when we were far enough away, it seemed. We were in the kindergarten wing now. Then we heard another sound echo from down the hallway. It seemed we weren't alone. But who could be in here was the question. The place was locked up and every light in the building was off. The sound scared us into going into the first classroom we could find and shutting the door. It was indeed a kindergarten classroom. We were now concerned we'd get in trouble, so we waited in silence with our flashlights off. The rain was still coming down hard, and there was still thunder and lightning crashing every 20 seconds or so. Suddenly the door to the classroom clicked open, and someone pushed it as it eerily creaked to a fully open position. We didn't see anyone at the doorway though, and the hallway was almost pitch black. We all tried our best to stay quiet, and then slowly something appeared through the doorway. It was the shape of a head. We all saw it, and when there was another flash of lightning, we saw what it was. It was in fact someone's head, looking into the classroom directly at us. I started apologizing for all of us, saying, "We're leaving." The person at the doorway didn't move. They motionlessly and almost lifelessly just peered around the doorway. In the classroom, Eddie asked, "Do you work here?" No response, and he had to _ this moment clearly. He handed me the bat as he struggled to unlock one of the windows to slide it open, just enough to crawl through. He crawled out first, then my other two friends, and I was last. Before I crawled out, I looked back one more time at the head at the doorway. I crawled through as quickly as I could, fearing I'd hear the person run up behind me and grab my legs. Once I was out, I ran to catch up with my friends, who were already booking it back to Eddie's car. We drove out of there in a hurry and never looked back. The building was torn down later that year, and has since been turned into a park. We never got in trouble for breaking into this day. We have no idea if that was some kind of worker or just some random person. Either way, it was extremely creepy behavior on their part when I was a freshman in college. I took a chemistry class. It was really difficult for me. The tables were arranged in groups of 4. I sat at an MLE middle table at the left side. All the way to the end next to me was a guy named Zach. He was very awkward. He gave me Reddit moderator vibes. To describe his appearance, he was like 5 feet 8 inches. He was a little overweight, and he had a really ugly patchy beard, but he knew his stuff in chemistry. I think he was just good in school. Overall, we started to talk in a pretty cordial way. When he noticed I sucked in class and I would ask him for help, he started offering to do my homework for me, and he even let me cheat off him on tests. I never got any kind of flirtatious vibes from Zach, but that might have been because he was just too awkward to flirt in person. He eventually asked for my number so that he could send me homework related stuff. Obviously, I gave it to him. He was helping me out a ton and didn't give off any threatening vibes. He just seemed a little reclusive. Fast forward to the last day of class, and Zach did something completely unexpected. He asked me if I wanted to go on a date with him after class. I had no physical attraction to Zach in the slightest, and our personalities were complete opposites, but he did help me throughout the semester maintain an A. So I had to let him down super politely. I lied and told him I'm going away to Miami for the next couple of weeks and won't be around. He right away responded, "What about when you get back?" I felt like 2 weeks was long enough of a gap in seeing each other where he would probably lose interest, so I said yeah, I could be around or something like that. He responded with a really cringy cool as he nodded his head in response. From here till the end of class that day was really awkward for me. After class, I left straight for my car and drove right home. I was a commuter, not a dormer. So after the last day of class was over, that was it. It was Thursday, and my other friends who went to the same school wanted to go out that night, so we hit town that night, and at some point I got a text from Zach. He asked, "When are you going to Miami?" I told my friends all about Zach while we were drunk, how he got me an A, but now he wanted a date. My friends joke that I should just go on the date with him to be nice. I joked back sarcastically, "Yeah, for sure." I told myself I'd respond to it later, but I was drunk and completely forgot to the next day. I woke up to 2 follow-up texts, one with question marks, and then the next one, "You're going to ignore me now that you don't need me anymore, right?" So I replied, "Hey, I'm sorry. I was packing. I'm going to Miami today." He replied almost instantly saying, "Okay." Obviously there was no Miami trip, but he should have never found that out. Later that night, my girls and I went out again, and while I got a scary text from Zach saying, "I thought you said you were going to Miami tonight." I almost dropped my drink. When I saw this, I showed it to my girls, and they were all freaked out just like I was. I replied to Zach, "What do you mean?" And he replied, "Nothing. Forget it. I just don't like liars." I genuinely was scared that I was being stalked. I looked around the whole bar, but he wasn't there, at least as far as I knew, so what the hell. I just didn't answer. At that point, I never planned on answering him again. It was until late that night, shortly after I got home, like literally taking my shoes off inside, that there were knocks at the door. It had to be like 1 a.m. I said, "Who is it?" And it was Zach on the other side. He said, "It's me." I wanted to scream. I was home alone. I yelled through the door to leave or my dad will come out and kick your ass. That seemed to work as he didn't knock again. I texted everyone I knew about the situation, my family, all my friends. I was horrified. Some suggested calling the police. I said I would go to the nearest station tomorrow, but tomorrow didn't even come yet when I received a super long, disgusting, ly weird and creepy text from. Guess who? I was appalled when I picked up my phone and read it. This is what it said: "I'm feeling a lot of emotions right now after being used by someone for months and then lied to and hurt, and anger are 2 of them. I thought from the start of the semester in chemistry class that our chemistry was through the roof. No pun intended. I must say I am hurt that you would make up something as elaborate as a 2-week-long Miami trip just to avoid going out with me, even after I stuck my neck out for you all semester and risked my own academic standing. I definitely have noticed the way you looked at me sometimes in class, and I can't pretend there wasn't a hint of interest there. All I'm asking for at this point is for 1 date. That's it. I'm not asking your hand in marriage, though I surely would be quite an ideal husband to have if I do say so myself. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt that you needed more time to think over the prospect of going on a date with me. I know how much I have to offer, much more than these losers all over campus. If you want, I can come back to your house and we can talk about it in person. I am only making this offer once. I'm just very crushed to feel like I wasted so much this semester for nothing. In return, yours truly, Zach." I sent this to everyone. I didn't care that it was 3 a.m. I called my dad until he picked up, and I told him how scared I was. After he read the text, he took it upon himself to send Zach a lengthy text of his own, and he attempted to call him like 10 times, but Zach is clearly too much of a coward to pick up that phone call. I also went to the police station the next day with a text saying I wanted to press charges, and one of the people working there said that Zach would be contacted. Zach never picked up any of the calls from the police who were trying to get him to come in for questioning, nor did he answer any of their text messages. Zach completely disappeared. I never heard from him again. Between the police contacting him and my dad's pretty scary texts and voicemails, that basement dwelling. The top 5 weirdest haunted railroad stories. In the 1800s, construction crews cut through mountains, soared over rivers, twisted around bends, and drove straight into towns and cities to build railroad lines that swept across the land like an iron and steel wildfire. On May 10, 1869, a seminal moment in railroad history, a golden spike was pounded into the final tie to officially commemorate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Railroads would connect states and nations, forever tying people and business together. Something else swept along with this marvel of construction and transportation, however, something that remains embedded in our collective psyche: railroad ghosts. Haunted railroad lore runs the full line of weird paranormal activity, from spooky, but well-documented, levitating light or orbs phenomena to apparitions of people appearing in train engines and cars. It includes tales of the wandering souls of long-dead railroad engineers, and even accounts that trains, the machines themselves, have rolled down the tracks of mortality and into the spirit world. This article will take us to some of these haunted railroad destinations. Arriving at our first stop on the itinerary through the 5 weirdest tales in haunted rail history is the tale of an assassinated president destined to live among the immortals, and his funeral train that took him there. 1. Abraham Lincoln's funeral train. On a particularly melancholy morning of April 19, 1865, Abraham Lincoln's funeral train drifted out of a Washington, D.C. depot to visit hundreds of thousands of grief-stricken citizens in 400 communities who had lined up to pay tribute to the assassinated great emancipator. Legend has it, though, that just because you were born more than a century too late for the spectacle of Abraham Lincoln's funeral train, you aren't too late for its specter. The ghost of this funeral train is said to retrace its route annually on the anniversary of its inaugural trip. Some say that if you're out along the rail lines that were once part of the funeral train's itinerary, which meandered through several mid-Atlantic and Midwestern states, you might see a black steam engine with fire belching from its smokestack glide eerily down the line. In case there is any doubt that what you are witnessing is an actual supernatural sight and not being fooled by some type of historical reenactment, witnesses say if you look through the window you can see that the president's coffin is laid out and an ever-vigilant group of Union soldiers, which some describe as ghosts and others as skeletons, keep watch over the coffin. 2. The dangers of working overtime at a railroad museum. The staff and volunteers at the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona, Pennsylvania are a lot like the people who the facility memorializes, the hardworking, loyal people who helped turn the small city of Altoona into a world-famous railroad hub. And one hardworking finance director at the museum found out just how loyal railroad spirits can be. I mean, they just don't want to leave. According to a now legendary Altoona ghost story told by multiple sources, the director walked from his office to the building's elevator after a long day of hard work. The director, who said he was usually the last one in the office, waited until the elevator door eventually swung open, and in he walked. But, shockingly, the director found that he wasn't alone on the elevator. A man stood on the other side of the elevator with his back to him. The unexpected guest casually looked over his shoulder at the dismayed finance director. Then, the man's body started to shimmy electrically and, eventually, completely disappeared. Later, the director noticed a railroad worker in a picture on display in the museum who looked similar, one might say hauntingly similar, to the man who shared his elevator ride into haunted railroad weirdness. He assumed this was the ghost of the man that he bumped into on his elevator ride into spooky railroad history. 3. Stamp of spooky approval. Not many paranormal phenomena earn a royal stamp of approval, but an elite group of spooky happenings in the Great White North, or better, the Great Fright North, were immortalized as Canadian postage stamps. Among them, the St. Louis Ghost Train stamp became highly sought after when the Post released the stamp to the public in 2014. The stamp celebrates a ghostly railroad tale that's been creeping out of the small, quaint village of St. Louis, Saskatchewan for decades. Witnesses say that eerie lights often dance along a stretch of railroad tracks outside of town. Some say that there is a white light and a red light. They believe that the white light represents the headlamp of a train, while the red light looks like a light that used to flash from the back of a caboose. Believers say that the lights are either from a ghost train that was part of a deadly train robbery or the ghost of a conductor who died in a horrible work accident along that section of track. Debunkers have other reasons for the phenomenon. Mainly, they say that the phenomenon is nothing more than a combination of automobile headlights and overactive imaginations. But the sightings continue, and continue to be vexing and spooky enough to be immortalized in stamp collections across Canada, and stamped in the time-space continuum that surrounds the village of St. Louis, Saskatchewan. 4. Ghost trains, non-fiction, fiction, or science fiction. Philip K. Dick, one of the world's most famous and talented science fiction authors, had some unorthodox views about reality. In his nearly half-million-word exegesis, the writer conjectures that reality is everything from a computer simulation to a vast Gnostic revelation. Dick had no trouble believing in another piece of weird phenomenon, ghost trains. According to several sources, including in Dick, his former wife who was living with him in Point Reyes Station at the time, Dick claimed to hear the phantom cry of a train as he tried to sleep. The trouble was that there were no trains around. Years before, the railroad had ceased functioning in that area. However, Dick's account did match up with a local ghost story that told of an angry engineer who haunted the old railroad line that once crisscrossed through Point Reyes Station. It is said the engineer once drove his train through the night trying to find the man who wronged his daughter. The wail of his whistle woke the sleepy community. Townsfolk said that the train's whistle still pierces the night during the engineer's vengeful run. Many witnesses have stepped forward to say that they have heard and seen the ghost train, and it just so happens we might count one of the world's most lauded science fiction writers as one of these lucky, or, depending on either your lack of sleep or fear of the unknown, unlucky witnesses. 5. Murder, the spirits wrote. Skeptics charge that railroad ghost stories are just that, stories, spooky tales that, while may impart some cultural or historic wisdom, aren't really true. But these doubters may have some trouble explaining the next story that takes place in Duffy's Cut, a section of railroad near Malvern, Pennsylvania. Since the late 19th century, dozens of people have claimed to see weird, floating orbs dancing around a trench near the railroad tracks. There were so many reports of what people said were the ghosts of Irish railroad workers that the railroad company began to collect and archive the stories. 2 men, who had heard the stories from their grandfather who worked for the railroad company, decided to investigate whether there was any truth to these legends. With help from university-trained scientists, these amateur anthropologists dug roughly where the ghost sightings occurred and found remains from what seemed to be a mass grave. More startling, the men found evidence that it wasn't a disease that killed the workers and their families, but, apparently, gunshot wounds. Thanks for sharing this ride through the 5 weirdest railroad stories with me. Feel free to share your own haunted railroad stories with me, too. I will share these stories on my channel.
Intercom in the house wasn't buzzing. My first thought was maybe I just caught the car turning around, but no bit. Stayed put like it was waiting for the gate to open. Then I figured it was Angie's parents arriving home early, and that I don't know, maybe they lost their key card or something. I walked into the dining room to get a closer look out of the window, studying the headlights as the car idled by the gate, and then, suddenly silhouetted by the car's headlights, I saw 3 or 4 men climb over the gate before they began walking down the driveway at a very brisk pace. I remember the feeling, this rising panic, as I put down the sodas on the ledge near the window and then walked toward the phone as quickly as I could. I remember grabbing the handset and trying not to sound too panicked as I loudly asked Angie to head upstairs. This was like a whole hour before her promised bedtime, so she was very naturally dismayed at the sudden change of plans and began asking me why. I told her to be a good girl and do as I asked before putting the phone's handset to my ear. I thought that I might hear the 911 person's voice, or at worst the last few dials before one answered my call, but instead I heard nothing. I remember pushing the little switch to reset the phone, expecting the drone of an open line to return, but I did it once, twice, and then 3 times before I realized that the line was dead. I didn't know it at the time. I thought that I'd simply experienced an astronomical amount of bad luck in having the phone die on me when I needed it most, but it hadn't died. There had been no kind of malfunction. Someone had cut the home's phone line to ensure that no emergency calls could be made. I knew the family had a second phone in the master bedroom, so after taking Angie's hand, I quickly walked us up the stairs and toward the bedroom door, and by then Angie had begun to sense how frightened I was, and she kept asking what was going on, her terror intensifying each time I let the question go.
I was camping with my husband and his family at a small, remote lake in New Mexico. There were about 10 people in our group and another group of 6 people in the next campsite. It was nighttime and both groups were doing typical activities, making s'mores, having a few drinks and telling stories, when we all heard what sounded like a little girl yelling out for help. Neither group had children with them, but we were all positive we were hearing a little girl and decided to search the area we heard the noises from together. There was a field behind our campsites, and we all saw a very tall, pure white figure standing maybe 100 feet away from us in the field, making the noises. We all agreed this thing looked maybe 6 feet tall, skinny, and white as can be. We made our way closer to investigate, but whatever it was that we saw started backing off as we got closer, and it disappeared into the trees. All night we continued to hear a little girl calling for help as we tried to sleep. The Walking Dead. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he couldn't talk, but there were no medical reasons as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the deep south and joined the military when he was 19, but one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, not the real name, and I've been dead for 10 years." Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day every day, moving his mouth that looked like talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later, I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. The unrest stopped. I was driving across country with my mom and sister when I was 16 and my sister was 20. It was late, but we were well rested still and alert. We were driving along an interstate and needed gas and a bathroom break, so we stopped at the only rest stop in 200 miles. There was a van full of teenagers on a road trip at the gas station, as well as a small gray car parked at the pump in front of us with two young men standing still outside of it. When we got there, everything felt wrong. We'd been on the road for days and seen many rest stops at night and had never been afraid until then. My mom and sister went inside and I stayed in the car. I heard the teenagers say they were creeped out and couldn't get the pump to work, and they left in a hurry. I was watching the car in front of us, and the two men had not moved at all. Not an inch. They weren't talking. They weren't on phones. They were just standing there, still as stone. My sister and mom came running back out to the car, and when they got in, the two men slowly turned to look at us while not moving or pivoting the rest of their bodies, and I swear to fucking shit, we all saw the same thing. They had eyes dark as pitch and empty. Truly empty. Not black, not reflecting any light at all, just a void. We sped out of there and didn't stop until we were in the next city. The worst thing about the entire experience? We couldn't find the place on any map. We knew exactly which spot on the interstate to look, and we couldn't find it on Google Maps or any paper map we had. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station out on that stretch of road and got only confused looks. We've traveled on that interstate since, and there is no rest stop. We were driving my friend's really old beat-up Subaru through a massive graveyard. We stopped and walked down a hill and came across a little pond. There was someone sitting on a rock on the other side of the pond. The figure was all black, and we couldn't make out any features other than the fact it looked like a man who was wearing some old-style top hat. We stupidly waved and shouted hi. He didn't show any acknowledgement and continued sitting still on the rock. All of a sudden, he jumped to his feet, started running to us on the water, and then vanished in thin water about halfway on the pond. My friends and I screamed and ran back to the car. The car wouldn't start, and we heard something banging on the back of the car. It wasn't a constant bang, but every few seconds or so we'd hear it. Nobody was outside from what we could see in the dark, but something was making a noise on the car. I opened my phone and started dialing my mom to come give us a boost, but I had no service. None of us had any cell service. The next 30 minutes were spent trying to get our car started. No banging was heard afterwards, but we felt this heavy pressure around us. Finally, the car started and she hit the pedal to the metal. We sped out of the graveyard so fast. Immediately crossing the gates, all of our phones regained cell service. One thing I know for certain is that someone or something was out there, and it was not an animal or a human. It was good to see an old friend. When I was 37, I went to my high school reunion. I flew into the nearest airport and rented a car. The distance was about 35 miles through a very rural and almost abandoned part of the country. About 3 miles outside of town, I see someone on the side of the road flagging me down. It turned out that it was one of the guys I had attended school with. Jim, not his name, gets in the car and we start talking. I had not seen him in 20 years, but he still looked the same, maybe a little older. We get to town and I ask him if he wants to come to the VFW and have a drink. He says no, just take me home. Jim's parents had lived only a few blocks from my grandmother's house, and I turned in that direction, but he said to take him to the outskirts of town. There was a mobile home park out there, and I figured that is where he lived. When we reached the end of the turnoff, he said, just drop me here. It was good to see you again, and he walks off into the night. I go to the VFW, met some of my old classmates, we start to talk. As we were talking about who was coming to the reunion, I mentioned that I had just picked Jim up 3 miles east of town and had dropped him off. Everyone gets quiet, even the guy singing karaoke stops and lays down the mic. My cousin goes white as a new t-shirt. Barb, Jim died on that curve 8 years ago. Rolled his car. We were all at his funeral, I was told. I started to feel really dizzy, and I went out to the car to take some deep breaths. There on the seat is the local newspaper, printed 8 years previous, containing Jim's obituary. I still have the paper. I worked as a forensic nurse in a hospital's lock-up unit. We had one older lady who swore she was being haunted and abused by a demon she would call Tiberius. So many crazy things happened while she was on the unit. We'd go into the room, do normal care, leave, and seconds later she'd start screaming bloody murder. We'd run into the room to find her looking like she'd been in a fight with a boxing champ, bloody lip, black eye, markings all over her body. No one ever saw her doing this stuff to herself. Things would get moved around the room by themselves. At one point she was in protective restraints because the doctor thought she was hurting herself. There was no way she could have moved or done anything to herself while in these restraints, but new marks would always appear or a tray/cart would be across the room. The room was secure, so there was no way someone else was doing this. When we asked her questions, she'd just say, "It was Tiberius." After she was discharged, we always had trouble with that room. If there was going to be a rapid response or code, it happened in that room. One night a guard reported lights blinking on and off. It was that room.
I was driving through the heart of America, somewhere in the Midwest, surrounded by miles of flat farmland and empty, open skies. It was one of those trips where the GPS assured me that I was on the right track, but every bone in my body told me I was hopelessly lost. It was close to midnight, and the highway was devoid of cars. Just me, my headlights, and a seemingly endless black road ahead. I hadn't seen a gas station, house, or even a sign for hours. Just fields, then more fields, and occasionally, the twisted remains of rusted cars abandoned on the side of the road. I tried to keep my mind off the isolation by listening to the radio, but every station was static. I flicked it off, settling into the eerie silence, and focused on the road. My car's gas tank was nearly empty, and my heart rate started to rise. There was nowhere to turn around, and nowhere to stop. All I could do was keep driving and hope to find some sign of life before I ran out completely. Then, a light appeared in the distance. A single, faint glow on the horizon. I couldn't tell if it was a gas station or just a reflection, but I didn't have a choice. I pushed the gas pedal a little harder, praying it would be something, anything that could get me out of here. As I got closer, the glow turned into the neon sign of a small diner. The place looked like it had been there forever, an old-style, retro joint that seemed out of place against the endless fields. It was the kind of place you'd see in a movie, faded red booths, a flickering sign that read Hank's Diner, and a handful of rusty cars in the gravel parking lot. I could have sworn those cars hadn't been there just moments before, but at this point, I didn't care. I pulled in, feeling a weird sense of relief. The diner was empty, but the lights were on, and through the window, I could see a waitress behind the counter, wiping down glasses. I stepped out of my car, stretching my legs. The air was heavy and thick, carrying an unsettling silence that felt unnatural. No insects chirping, no hum of distant engines. Just silence. When I walked into the diner, a bell above the door jingled. The waitress looked up and smiled, but it was a little too wide, a little too perfect, like she was hiding something behind it. She was in her 50s, wearing an old-fashioned blue dress and apron, her hair done up in a bun. "Welcome to Hank's," she said, in a sweet, honey-drenched tone. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Actually, I'm really just looking for some gas," I said, glancing out the window, hoping to see a pump nearby. She didn't answer immediately, just tilted her head and looked at me, her eyes unblinking. "Sure thing, honey. Just have a seat, and Hank will be right out." I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and drive, but the empty road and my near-empty gas tank left me little choice. I sat in one of the booths, the vinyl creaking under me. The waitress placed a coffee in front of me. I hadn't ordered it, but I didn't mention it. As I looked around, I realized the walls were decorated with old photographs. Black and white pictures of people who looked like they belonged to another era. Some were families, some were couples, all staring straight into the camera with wide, eerie grins. "Locals?" I asked, trying to make conversation to ease my nerves. The waitress didn't answer, just nodded and smiled that too wide smile. Her eyes never left me. Minutes ticked by, but Hank never showed. I was about to leave when I noticed a figure standing outside by my car, a tall man in coveralls, holding a gas can. I let out a sigh of relief, figuring this must be Hank. I got up and headed for the door, but the waitress quickly stepped in front of me. "He'll take care of it," she said softly. "Just sit tight." I looked at her, confused. But when I glanced back outside, I saw Hank pouring gas into my tank. Something in me wanted to argue, but I was tired, and it seemed harmless enough. Maybe they just ran things differently out here. After a few minutes, the bell above the door chimed again, and Hank walked in. He was tall, with gray hair slicked back, and he wore an old, stained cap low over his eyes. His hands looked gnarled, like he'd worked with his hands his whole life. "All set," he said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. He didn't smile, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Thank you." I didn't see a gas pump," I stammered, feeling a strange tension in the air. "We're a bit unconventional," he replied, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. I fumbled for my wallet to pay him, but he shook his head. "No need for that. We'll settle up another way." That made me pause, but before I could question him, he gave a curt nod and walked back outside. I looked at the waitress, and she just smiled, giving a small wave. I forced a polite smile, thanked her, and walked out. The feeling of relief I'd expected didn't come. Instead, a heavy dread lingered in my chest. I got in my car, the engine humming to life, and took one last look back at the diner. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The diner was gone. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the gravel lot was empty, and the diner, along with its neon sign and old cars, had vanished without a trace. My heart pounded, but I pressed the pedal, desperate to put distance between me and that strange place. I checked the gas gauge, it was full. I drove for miles, and soon the horizon started to lighten with the coming dawn. Relieved, I finally saw a sign for a small town. When I reached it, I pulled over at a gas station and asked the attendant if he'd ever heard of Hank's Diner. He gave me a puzzled look. There hasn't been a diner out that way in decades. Hank's Diner burned down back in the 50s. Whole family died in the fire. I felt a cold chill run through me as he went on. They say sometimes, folks get stranded on that highway, and when they're desperate, Hank's Diner shows up. But, folks don't always make it back. I got in my car, the full tank mocking me, and sped away from that town as fast as I could, never looking back. Mike had been a truck driver for years, used to long stretches of empty highways and nights spent with only the radio for company. But tonight, something felt wrong. He'd been driving for nearly 12 hours, hauling cargo from Denver to Chicago, and though he'd planned to pull off at the next rest stop, he felt an unusual urge to keep going. Maybe it was the faint static on the radio, like whispering, or the strange fog creeping in. He adjusted his rearview mirror. That's when he saw it, a man sitting in the back seat. Mike's heart stopped. He jerked the wheel, nearly skidding off the road, but quickly corrected himself. He glanced back at the mirror. The back seat was empty. "Must be exhaustion," he muttered, exhaling a shaky breath. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel tighter. He pushed on, keeping his eyes fixed forward, refusing to check the mirror again. But after a few miles, curiosity overpowered him. He glanced back at the mirror. There he was again. The figure, slouched in the back seat, pale face half lit by the dashboard's glow. He wore a tattered black suit and had eyes that seemed to swallow light. This time, the man leaned forward. A voice as cold as the fog whispered, "Mike." Mike swerved, heart pounding, pulling his truck over to the side of the road. He practically threw himself out of the cab, stumbling into the night air, breathing heavily. His heart raced as he circled the truck, shining his flashlight into the cab. There was no one. Just the empty seats, the worn-out leather, and his bag on the passenger seat. He shook his head, desperate to convince himself it was a hallucination. Slowly, he climbed back in, locking all the doors. He turned the key, and the truck's engine roared to life. "I just need to keep moving," he said, glancing at the road ahead. But as he pulled back onto the highway, the radio crackled, and he heard it again, Mike. The voice. He turned off the radio, the eerie silence somehow worse. Then came a soft rustling. Mike's skin prickled as he felt a sudden chill at the back of his neck, like someone breathing down his spine. He glanced in the mirror. This time, the man was right behind him, inches away, his eyes empty, staring through Mike as if seeing something far beyond. Mike slammed the brakes, but the figure didn't move, his gaze unbroken. And then, the man spoke in that same, hollow voice, "You left me." In a flash, memories flooded back, foggy, fragmented, but unmistakable. Years ago, he'd driven these same roads with his younger brother, who'd been hitchhiking to make it home. The two had argued, a brutal, angry exchange. Mike had abandoned him in the middle of the night, leaving him alone on that cold, foggy road. It was on a night just like this. The memory hit like a punch to the gut. His brother had disappeared that night, never making it home, never seen again. A pang of guilt twisted in Mike's stomach, but he didn't have time to think. The figure in the back seat reached out, a cold hand grasping his shoulder, tight and unyielding. The last words Mike heard were a whisper, cold and relentless, "I'm taking you with me." In the morning, a patrol officer found Mike's truck abandoned by the roadside, still running. The seat belt was stretched and twisted, as if someone had struggled against it, and the window was frosted over despite the warm air. No one ever saw Mike again. But sometimes, on foggy nights, truck drivers on that lonely stretch of highway swear they see a figure in a black suit standing by the road, waiting for a ride that will never come. Let me know if you enjoyed the story. Rachel loved the open road. Every Friday night, she drove 3 hours from her college town to visit her family in the countryside. The trip was usually uneventful, just miles of empty road and the hum of her car for company. But one night, as she drove through a narrow, winding stretch of road, she noticed something strange on her GPS. The usual route was marked with a detour she'd never seen before. Rerouting, the GPS's robotic voice intoned, instructing her to take a right turn into an old, unmarked road. She hesitated but figured it might be a shortcut and turned, letting the GPS guide her. The road was barely paved and lined with twisted, leafless trees that cast long shadows in her headlights. Fog began to drift in, thickening as she went deeper. Soon, it was so dense that she could barely see a few feet ahead. Her GPS screen flickered and froze. The voice on the GPS glitched, repeating the same line in a distorted voice, "Turn left, turn left, turn left." Rachel's stomach knotted as she looked for any sign of a way out. Just as she considered turning back, she noticed dim headlights approaching in her rearview mirror. Relief washed over her. At least she wasn't alone on this eerie road. She kept driving, glancing at the lights in her mirror for reassurance. But something was off. No matter how fast she drove, the lights stayed the same distance behind her, unwavering, keeping pace. Rachel felt a chill creep up her spine. Curious, and a little unnerved, she slowed down, hoping the car behind her would pass. But it slowed, too. She sped up again, and the headlights matched her, keeping that same haunting distance. Now her heart was pounding. She tried to make out the car, but the fog was so thick that all she could see were the beams of light piercing through the mist. "Turn right," the GPS droned suddenly, jolting her from her thoughts. She looked to the right and saw a side road barely visible through the fog. Without thinking, she turned, hoping to lose whoever was behind her. But as she glanced in her rearview mirror, she saw the headlights were still there, turning onto the side road, following her every move. Panic flared as she sped up, her fingers tightening around the wheel. She didn't know where she was or how to get back to the main road. The car kept trailing her, its headlights growing brighter, closer. Her heart raced as she heard something else, a faint, rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking on her trunk. Ignoring it, she kept her focus on the road, but the knocking grew louder, faster. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and to her horror, she saw a figure in the back seat, a man with dark, hollow eyes staring directly at her. She screamed, swerving the car, and nearly skidded off the road. When she dared to look back, the man was gone, but the headlights behind her remained, closing in. The knocking started again, this time sounding almost like a heartbeat. "Come home," a voice whispered from the back seat, so soft that it barely reached her ears. Rachel's hands were shaking as she tightened her grip on the wheel. She couldn't think clearly. Was she hallucinating? Was she just tired? She forced herself to look in the mirror one more time. The figure was back, his eyes burning into her. His face was twisted into an expression of pure rage. "Turn around," he whispered. With a trembling hand, Rachel veered off the road, slamming the brakes as she skidded to a stop. The headlights behind her stopped, too, just a few yards away, motionless in the fog. Her chest heaved as she sat there, frozen, unable to move, praying it would all disappear. Then the headlights began to slowly approach. But as they neared, they weren't headlights anymore. They were two hollow, glowing eyes. She looked back into her car, her heart stopping as she saw that the man had somehow moved closer, his hand reaching for her shoulder. Rachel screamed, throwing herself out of the car and stumbling onto the cold ground. She looked up, expecting to see a face, but found herself alone on the empty road. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a clear path back to the main road. Her car was empty. The man was gone. She climbed back in, her hands still shaking, and drove home without looking in the mirror once. She never took that route again. And sometimes, when she's driving at night, she checks her back seat, just to make sure she's really alone. Let me know if you enjoyed this one.
One. The whispers beneath the floorboards. Emma had always been fond of old houses, with their creaky floorboards and vintage charm. When she bought the Victorian house on the outskirts of town, she was excited to restore it and make it her own. The place had been abandoned for years, and though the realtor had warned her about the strange occurrences in the neighborhood, Emma dismissed them as rumors. The first few nights in the house were peaceful, but on the fifth night, something changed. As she lay in bed, she started hearing faint whispers from beneath the floorboards. At first, it was so soft she thought it was just the house settling. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, almost like voices. One night, Emma was jolted awake by a sudden, distinct whisper right beside her ear, "Help us." Terrified, she tried to locate the source. The sound seemed to be coming from under the floorboards in the corner of the room. She got a crowbar and pried up the boards, revealing a small, dirt-filled crawl space. The whispers became frantic, now pleading, desperate. Curiosity overcame fear, and she crawled into the space. It was dark, the air thick with the smell of rot. As her eyes adjusted, she saw something that made her blood run cold: old, tattered clothing, broken furniture, and bodies. Dozens of them, some mummified, others fresh face down, limbs twisted in unnatural angles. In the far corner, there was a note. Emma picked it up, trembling. It read, "They come every night. Don't let them hear you. Don't let them know you're here." Suddenly, the walls around her seemed to close in. The whispers turned into screams. Something began moving in the darkness, something large and heavy. Emma tried to crawl back to the hole, but the air turned ice cold, and a hand reached out of the shadows, grabbing her ankle. She screamed, but the hand yanked her down into the darkness. Her body was found a week later, but her eyes had been gouged out, and her mouth was twisted into a silent scream. 2. The man in the yellow coat. Greg had been working the night shift at the convenience store for over a month. The store was located in a small town on the edge of nowhere, with few customers passing through after dark. One stormy night, as he wiped down the counter, the bell above the door jingled, signaling the entrance of a customer. It was a man tall, thin, and wearing an old-fashioned yellow coat. Greg looked up, smiling politely. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't reply. Instead, he walked past the counter slowly, his eyes fixed on the back of the store, where the shelves of canned goods were lined up. His movements were stiff, unnatural. Greg thought it was odd, but he didn't think too much of it at the time. The man walked to the back of the store, then paused. He turned around and slowly walked back to the counter, still not saying a word. Greg felt an unsettling chill run down his spine. There was something deeply wrong about the man's eyes. They were glazed, empty, like he was staring into nothingness. "Are you okay?" Greg asked, trying to sound casual. The man stared at him, and for a moment Greg could have sworn he saw a faint smile tug at the corners of his lips. Then, without a word, the man turned and walked out the door. Later that night, as Greg locked up the store, he realized that the door had been left unlocked. He checked the security footage. The man had never come back out. There was no trace of him, no sound of the door jingling, no footsteps, nothing. It was as if he had never existed. Greg returned to his apartment, shaken. That night, he dreamt of the man in the yellow coat, standing at the foot of his bed, grinning. The man reached out with cold hands, placing them on Greg's chest. As he did, Greg felt something heavy, something dark and ancient pressing down on him, crushing the air out of his lungs. When Greg woke up, he was alone, but his chest was bruised, as if someone had been pressing on it for hours. His phone buzzed with a news alert: local man found dead at convenience store. Cause of death unknown. 3. The endless road. It was supposed to be a short drive. Rachel and her boyfriend Jason had decided to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin in the mountains. The weather was perfect, the drive was smooth, and the weekend was looking to be everything they had hoped for. But that changed when they took a wrong turn. They had been driving down a winding road for hours, deep into the mountains. The further they went, the more desolate it became. No signs of life, no other cars, just trees and the occasional dilapidated building. As the sun began to set, they realized they hadn't seen a road sign or turnoff in hours. The GPS had no signal, and the only thing they had was the winding road ahead of them. They kept driving, but something felt off. Jason tried to keep the mood light, but Rachel noticed how tense he was becoming. "Maybe we should turn around," she suggested, but Jason insisted they were fine. Then the car sputtered and the engine died. Panic set in. They were miles from the nearest town, and there was no cell signal. The darkness around them was absolute. Rachel got out of the car and immediately felt a strange sense of unease. The silence was suffocating. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the oppressive stillness of the woods. Jason tried to start the car, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, Rachel saw something moving in the distance, a figure, tall and shadowy, standing in the middle of the road. She called out to Jason, but when he turned, the figure vanished. A few seconds later, they both heard it, a soft, distorted voice calling from the trees, "Come closer." Rachel froze. She had seen something in the woods, something unnatural. Suddenly, the road stretched out before them, longer and darker than it should have been. They turned around and saw the same stretch of road behind them, an endless loop that never seemed to end. No matter which way they drove, the same figure appeared in the distance. Each time it grew closer. By dawn, Rachel and Jason had disappeared. The road was empty again, as if they had never been there at all. 4. The Dollmaker's Curse. In the late 1800s, a man known as the Dollmaker was infamous for creating lifelike dolls. His creations were said to be so realistic that they could fool even the most discerning eye. But the Dollmaker wasn't simply an artisan, he had dark secrets. One evening, a young woman named Clara visited the Dollmaker's shop, intrigued by the rumors surrounding his work. She was mesmerized by the dolls, perfectly crafted, with glassy eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. The Dollmaker offered her a deal if she could sit still for 1 hour. He would give her a special gift, a doll more beautiful than any she had ever seen. Clara agreed, thinking it would be an easy task. But as the minutes ticked by, she began to feel strange. Her body grew stiff, her vision blurred, and her heartbeat slowed. By the time the hour was up, Clara found herself unable to move, her limbs frozen, her thoughts trapped within her body. The Dollmaker smiled at her, then whispered, "You're the perfect model. Clara's body was turned into one of his lifelike creations, her soul trapped inside the doll. But her story didn't end there. Decades later, a young girl named Lucy bought one of the doll maker's dolls, Clara. As soon as Lucy touched the doll, the eyes flickered and a whisper echoed in her mind, "Help me." Lucy didn't know it, but the curse had passed on. As long as the doll was kept in the house, Clara's soul would remain, forever searching for release. But as the years passed, Lucy began to feel her own body grow stiff, her movements slower. And every time she looked at Clara, the doll seemed a little more alive. 5. The Mirror Man. Rebecca had always been fascinated by mirrors. She had a collection of antique ones, some centuries old, each one with a story behind it. But the newest edition was different. It was a large, ornate mirror she found at a flea market, its silver frame intricate, almost sinister. The shopkeeper had warned her that it came from a dark place, but she was too intrigued to heed the warning. After hanging the mirror in her living room, strange things began happening. It started with her reflection. At night, when she would pass by the mirror, it would seem as if her reflection didn't move quite as she did. It would lag behind, almost as though it was trying to catch up. But the worst came when she saw him. One evening, as she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair, she noticed a figure standing just behind her reflection. It was a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes, staring at her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. She spun around, but the room was empty. When she looked back into the mirror, the man was gone. But now, her reflection was smiling. From that night on. 4. Oh Minnie. The Haunting of Blackwood High. Blackwood High had always been an eerie place, even before the rumors started. Located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dark woods and mist, it had a reputation for being haunted, though no one could quite say why. The older students whispered about the strange occurrences, lights flickering in empty classrooms, shadowy figures glimpsed in the corners of hallways, and the chilling sound of footsteps echoing through the abandoned parts of the school late at night. But it wasn't until Emma transferred there in her junior year that she began to experience it firsthand. From her first day, Emma felt something wasn't quite right. The school was unsettlingly quiet, even during the busiest hours. She could always hear her own footsteps, and the sound of lockers opening and closing seemed muffled, as though the walls themselves were swallowing the noise. The teachers were strange, too. Mrs. Larson, her history teacher, had an unnerving way of looking at the students, as though she was seeing something beyond them, something only she could comprehend. And the janitor, Mr. Hale, never seemed to leave. He'd sweep the same hallway for hours, mumbling to himself in a language Emma couldn't place. One afternoon, Emma stayed after school to finish a project in the library. The building was nearly deserted, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. As she worked, she felt an odd pressure in the air, as though the very space around her was growing heavier with each passing minute. The shadows stretched longer, clinging to the walls, and the temperature dropped, her breath visible in the air. She shook it off as nothing more than a trick of her mind. But then, she heard something, a whisper. Emma. The voice was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the back of the library. Her heart skipped. She wasn't alone. Tentatively, she walked toward the sound. It was coming from behind a stack of old books, a place she had never noticed before. Her fingers brushed the edges of the shelf, and with a creak, the book slid open, revealing a hidden door. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The room beyond was dark, so dark that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in around her. Then she heard it again, the whisper, now closer, more insistent. Help me. She fumbled for her phone, using the weak flashlight to scan the room. Her light flickered across the walls, and for a moment she thought she saw something. No, someone standing in the corner. A tall, thin figure, draped in shadows, its face obscured. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The whisper grew louder, almost frantic now. Emma backed away, her heart racing. But as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Panicked, she pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her phone flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. She was trapped. The whispers surrounded her now from all directions, a chorus of desperate voices that seemed to be coming from the very walls themselves. "Help me, you shouldn't be here. Leave." Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against her arm. Emma screamed, spinning around, but no one was there. The temperature in the room dropped to freezing, and she could see her breath clouding in the air. A figure emerged from the shadows, this time clearly visible, a tall woman with hollow eyes and a twisted, bloodless smile. Her mouth opened, and the whispers turned to a horrifying wail. "You shouldn't have come here." In a panic, Emma lunged for the door, throwing her weight against it. It groaned and finally cracked open, allowing her to tumble out into the hallway. She didn't stop running until she was outside, gasping for breath, the dark woods looming like a silent watcher in the distance. That night, she barely slept. The faces of the shadows haunted her dreams, their whispers echoing in her ears. She tried to tell her friends, but no one believed her. They laughed it off as just a bad experience, a trick of her mind. But the next morning, when Emma went to class, she noticed something unsettling. The walls were covered in new scratches, deep gouges, as though something or someone had been trying to escape. And when she passed the library on her way to the cafeteria, she swore she saw movement through the windows, figures pacing back and forth, trapped inside. As the days went by, Emma began to notice that she wasn't the only one hearing the whispers anymore. Students who had never mentioned anything about the school's strange history started to talk about the voices, the shadows, the coldness. The rumors, it seemed, were true. Blackwood High wasn't just haunted, it was alive, a place where the dead could speak, and those who listened were never truly safe. By the end of the month, Emma knew what she had to do. The only way to escape Blackwood High was to forget, to leave the school behind and never look back. But as she packed her things, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. And from somewhere deep within the school, she heard it one last time. "You can never leave." The whispers were now inside her head. The whispering hallway. It was the middle of my sophomore year in high school when I first heard the whispers. Our school was old, over 100 years old, and had a reputation for being haunted. There were always rumors among the students about strange happenings, flickering lights, doors slamming shut on their own, and the feeling that someone was watching you when you were alone. Most of us shrugged it off as urban legends, but that all changed one afternoon. I was staying late after school to finish an assignment. I liked to study in the library, which was located at the far end of the second floor. The hallway leading to it was dimly lit, even in the daytime, with only a few small windows that let in weak light. I had been working for about an hour when I decided to take a break and grab a drink from the vending machine. As I walked through the hallway, I heard the soft sound of whispers. At first I thought it was just the air conditioning or maybe a group of students in a classroom nearby, but the voices grew louder, as if they were right behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there, just an empty, dimly lit hallway stretching out behind me. I froze for a moment, listening. The whispers weren't normal. They were quiet, but they sounded like words, like conversations, but I couldn't make out anything specific. The air felt cold, and a strange pressure settled in my chest. I kept walking, trying to ignore it, but the whispers followed. They seemed to be growing more insistent, like they were trying to tell me something. By the time I reached the vending machine, I was practically running, my heart racing in my chest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. I grabbed a soda quickly, turned, and started back down the hallway. That's when it happened. I swear I heard my name being called. A faint, soft voice from behind me, just barely audible. But when I looked, there was no one in sight. My pulse shot up. The whispers stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I hurried back to the library, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall, and locked myself inside. When I told my friends the next day, they looked at me like I was crazy, but I wasn't the only one who had experienced it. Several others, including some of the teachers, had heard the whispers in that hallway over the years. Some believed it was the spirit of a former student who had tragically died in the building decades ago. Others thought it was just a quirk of the old building, but no one really knew for sure. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed whenever I passed through that hallway. I didn't stay late at school again for months, and though I never heard the whispers again, I always felt as though something or someone was just out of sight, watching. To this day, I still avoid that hallway when I can. The haunting of Maplewood High. Maplewood High was a school like any other, nestled in a quiet town where the old brick walls and creaky floors gave the building a sense of history. But there was something different about room 212. It was the last classroom on the second floor, tucked away at the far end of the hall. The door was always locked, even when no one had been inside for hours. Students whispered about it, but no one dared to ask questions. It started with Sarah, a freshman who had transferred to Maplewood in the middle of the semester. She was quiet, bookish, and had an odd fascination with the school's history. One afternoon during her lunch break, she overheard some seniors talking about the old room. Room 212, one of them scoffed. They say a teacher died in there years ago. Nobody knows how, but sometimes. You can feel her presence. Sarah was intrigued. That evening, she couldn't shake the story from her mind. She decided to visit the room after school the next day, convinced it was all just a myth. As the final bell rang and the hallways cleared, she made her way up to the second floor. The hallway was eerily silent, the fluorescent lights flickering above her. When she reached the end of the corridor, she found the door to room 212 slightly ajar, just enough to peek inside. The classroom was empty, the desks arranged in neat rows, the chalkboard covered in faint, forgotten writing. She stepped inside, the air cold against her skin. The windows were sealed shut, but there was a strange draft that made her shiver. As she wandered to the back of the room, something caught her eye, a small, dusty book on the teacher's desk. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn, as if it had been untouched for decades. Curiosity got the better of her, and she reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed the book's cover, a sharp, cold wind swept through the room. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Sarah froze, her heart pounding. Then, she heard a soft, whispering voice, just beyond the reach of her hearing. She couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakable, the voice of a woman, distant but unmistakably urgent. Suddenly, the lights flickered out. The room was plunged into darkness. Panic surged through Sarah, and she scrambled to the door, trying to turn the handle. It wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was moving closer. The cold intensified, and Sarah felt a presence behind her. Turning around slowly, her breath caught in her throat. There, in the dim light of the emergency exit sign, she saw a shadowy figure standing by the window. It was a woman, pale and thin, her face gaunt and her eyes wide with an expression of sorrow and anger. "Leave," the voice whispered again, but this time it was clearer. "Leave, before it's too late." Terrified, Sarah stumbled backward, her hand finally finding the door handle. She yanked it open, and the room instantly went silent. The figure was gone. The coldness evaporated, but Sarah didn't wait to see if it would return. She ran down the hall, out of the school, and didn't stop until she was home. The next day, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She told a few friends what had happened, but they all laughed it off, dismissing it as just an overactive imagination. But Sarah wasn't the same after that. She began to feel drawn to room 212, as if something was calling her back. One evening, when she could no longer resist, she returned to the school alone. The door to room 212 was unlocked this time, and she entered without hesitation. The classroom seemed unchanged, but as she stepped inside, a strange noise echoed through the room like the faint sound of someone writing on the chalkboard. She turned toward the board, and there, in neat, precise handwriting, were the words, "I didn't want to die." Before she could react, a figure appeared before her. The woman's face was pale, her features twisted in agony. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a rush of cold air. The lights flickered once more, and when they returned, the woman was gone. Sarah ran out of the room and never returned to the school again. The rumors about room 212 persisted, and to this day, no student dares to enter the room after hours. Some say the spirit of the teacher still lingers, trapped in the room by the tragic event that happened long ago. Others say the ghost is still waiting for someone to unlock the mystery of her death and to free her from the torment that keeps her bound to the classroom. But one thing is certain: room 212 remains locked at night, and no one ever dares to disturb the dead.